Now we welcome you to continue this second regional conference on the IPCC climate change and solutions towards the COP26. We remind everyone that we're broadcasting through corelac.org website, and you can leave your questions and comments through the website, or you can also access simultaneous interpretation in real time. You can see this next panel about conservation of oceans under the moderation of Paloma Avila, Director of the Science and Future Area of CNN Chile. We welcome all of the panel members. Valdemar Kut, who is connecting right now, Director of Environment and Maritime Affairs of the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Chile, and from the Environment and Oceanic Affairs Directorate is responsible for coordinating Chile's position in international forums where these topics are discussed, with the intention of disseminating the diverse commitments that Chile has assumed internationally. So we wait for Valdemar Kurt's connection, and we'll present the rest of the panel members. Oceanographer and defender of the advocate of the oceans, explorer, and author of several documentaries for National Geographic since 1998. Sylvia was the first head scientific of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and was named by Time magazine as the first hero of the planet in 1998. She's dedicated her entire life to study the situation of oceans. Welcome, Sylvia. Also, Laura Ramajo is here with us, biologist and with a master's in ecology in global change and researcher of the Center for Advanced Studies in Arid Areas, dry areas. Her research is focused in different physiological patterns in marine species, offering resistance and tolerance to a changing ocean, knowing that we need now to define different areas of conservation. Laura is the author of the 6th report of the IPCC in the chapter Central America and South America. Welcome, Laura. Also with us, Philip Hamilton, documentalist, photographer, conservationist, with over 30 years dedicated to diving and conservation, worldwide recognized for his work documenting the lives of marine animals in the planet. In his own words, the sea to me was always a need. Author and director of the world-renowned movies Adaptations, launched last year actually, where many marine scientists covering the world during 18 months participated. Very welcome, Philip Hamilton. Now, Laura, you are now in charge of moderating this panel, Climate Change and Ocean Conservation. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this much needed discussion about oceans. We who are earthlings walking on Earth are so blind about the ocean. It is hard for us to value what we cannot see. Let's take care of it. And so it's been proven by all of the IPCC reports speaking about the acceleration of the degradation of the oceans and the impact on the productivity and human life, and how we are left with less, a little bit less every time for humanity and all of the species coexisting with us in this planet, particularly associated to phenomena such as weather regulation, climate regulation. We know that the ocean is the responsible for regulating the climate and also conserving habitats that are unique and very needed for the lives of other species and ours. It feeds us in many cases and creates endless ecosystemic services that we continue to study to understand this bond that we have, which is impossible to break with the ocean, but it's hard for us to understand and assimilate, which is why we want to dedicate this panel today to better understand those relationships, comprehend their relevance, and see what we are missing for the long term. What are we putting at risk? And for that, we'll see the presentations of the different panelists. So we then move to a conversation. Hopefully we'll have the time. Sylvia, are you already connected to present? Okay, we'll go then with Laura. All right. Everything's so spontaneous, in this the climate is not only ever changing, but this context as well. So Laura, I'll give the floor to you. We'll begin with your presentation and then we'll move to the other ones. Hello, everyone. How are you? Good morning from Coquimbo. And many, many thanks for this invitation to the second regional conference on climate change by the IPCC. I also participated in the first conference, so I'm truly happy to continue supporting Fundación MERI and the IPCC in this event today. Well, I was asked to speak about the coastal communities and how these can adapt to climate change. So I prepared a very short presentation showing many of the topics that have been addressed before in previous talks, in previous panels, and more about the perspective. I'll focus my presentation on the perspective of research, where I come from. Could you show me the next slide, please? Well, I believe that in every previous panels, it's been made clear what is the role of oceans and what are the contributions of oceans to society, to the human society. And I would like to remind you that oceans cover over 70% of the planet and contain over 90% of the water of the planet. And as previous panelists said, humans have a very tight relationship with oceans from past times, and a very good part of evolution of the human being has been related to coasts, oceans, and the different uses that these provide in terms of food and culture and opportunities that we will cover later. And today, over 680 million people live in coastal areas. Many of these coastal areas are in a very low altitude. And for 2050, we forecast that millions of people could be living in these areas, many more millions. So this is one of the main contributions shown in the images of oceans going beyond the cultural aspects and what we use to sports or tourism. These are an important source of biodiversity and contain several ecosystems that are so relevant from the mitigation and adaptation perspective and provide us with opportunities of employment, food, medicine, etc. So climate change and the effects of it to oceans are truly concerning and very significant because of the same link that I was telling you about. Well, the IPCC in 2019 published this wonderful report, which was very focused on oceans and cryosphere. And on the side of the oceans, it determined at a regional scale how each one of the effects, physical, biological, at the level of ecosystem, and the impacts on natural system and on humans. And from the perspective of Latin America and Central America, I'd like to mention that the impacts are already visible, as you all know. This report, the special report on oceans and cryosphere, already determined that important changes in temperature of the ocean and acidification, which is increasing the levels and decreasing levels of pH and in oxygen. All of this has very significant impacts. And in many of these ecosystems that provide us with these contributions and benefits to human communities, as we saw in previous panels, the coral reefs as well, and the mangroves, and many other ecosystems. all of this has an impact on human systems, or food safety, food security, uh, hospitality systems, tourism, all of the uses that we give to the coastal areas. And one of the important conclusions of this special report was the confidence that we have in these changes. And something truly important for our region, uh, and something that has been historically identified, is being one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change, to many other reasons that are underlying or that come from the past. There are few studies, or not enough studies, that help us determine mainly and effectively the size of change that will increase, that increases our vulnerability and therefore our exposure to climate change. Hence, there are important facts. The example of Chile about the algae, which have an impact on local communities and the health of people, etc. Now, next one, please. We don't always want to speak about the negative perspective, right? There are options to adapt to changes beyond all of the other strategies of mitigation to climate change that will allow to attack the root cause of climate change, the coastal communities, by being exposed to these changes in levels of oxygen, temperature, and the sea level rises and increases in extreme events and important changes in species distribution, particularly those that are subject to fishing or aquaculture. Well, there are measures that could be based, as there have been many examples now, the hard protection such as dike or walls that will prevent dams, or that will prevent the sea level rise. There are different structures. There are measures that are broadly used and that are extremely important to be based on nature or based on ecosystems, that start from this conservation and this conservation and restoration of ecosystems that are so important and that provide so many ecosystemic services and contributions to society, human society.
We also have the adaptation and the different events, the increase of the problems in the coastal areas, and also they obligate us to move to other localities, and that we can have to go back or to even have to plan changes in the way that we use the coastal zones and that are also influenced by the ocean. Now, from the fisheries and agriculture point of view, which is very important for our region, the Humboldt Current is one of the most productive currents. And of course, we're seeking this diversification of resources and to be able to change the resources and to tackle the vulnerabilities of the coastal communities that live off fishing and aquaculture. But as I said before, well, these exist in the different areas that can be used in a generic manner, and that, as the IPCC states in its reports, it identifies these risks, these options, potential options through this evaluation of information which is published, the scientific information. And then we could use this information, which is very important in understanding the systems, the physical system, the biological system, the human systems, and to develop a dynamic plan for adaptation that incorporates all of this information that, as we said before, with the examples, and that potentially could be implemented. And later to monitor the effectivity of these measures, and to be able to apply correction measures with the objective of not ending in measures that end adaptation and that are poor adaptation measures. The interesting point here is that if climate change is dynamic and adaptation to it is dynamic, and it must be monitored to understand if that the measures that are being implemented are adequate. And also because in the measure that we're obtaining results, we could also carry out changes that improve the activities and measures taken. To wrap up with the next slide, I just wanted to comment that from the point of view of science, which is the main focus that the IPCC has, it's sustained in scientific information and information which is evaluated for the effects of different areas from the areas of physical sciences, biological sciences, social sciences, economy, and the importance that science has in monitoring how these how climate change affects the natural systems and the social systems, the creation of alert systems, as Ana Maria presented in the previous panel, the initiative of Blue Boat Initiative, for example, the alert systems that allow coastal communities and users of the oceans can take measures to protect themselves from certain events and from aspects such as hurricanes, high tides, etc., and without needing to invest in maintaining these early alerts. Of course, the continued use of knowledge and generation of knowledge will continue to determine the patterns or what are the changes that affect these species, ecosystems, people, the raising of information on vulnerability, the adaptability from different areas that are multifaceted, multi-sectorial, and being able to incorporate all of this to be able to have this information reach and communicate the information to society so that it can also start adapting to climate change, because one of the greatest indicators in climate change is one of the challenges involved is taking the information to communities so that it can be inserted into its decision making. And well, my presentation was quite short, so we could have more discussion time. So I will wrap up here. Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura, for your presentation. Now we're going to give the floor to Sylvia Earle. For those of you that are joining us right now, as you know, she's a marine biologist, oceanographer, and defender of the oceans, and she has Chile in her heart. We've seen her here many times. Silvia, es un agrado tenerla aquí. Su turno. Adelante. You're on mute, Silvia. Ok. Quedó demostrado en la presentación anterior que primero tienen que identificar la naturaleza del problema y por la primera vez en el siglo XXI, alrededor de estos tiempos, somos capaces de ver que tenemos un problema. Si volvemos a hace 50 años atrás, algunas personas anticiparon que el clima y el cambio climático iba a ser un gran problema, pero la mayoría de la gente realmente no lo tomó en serio. Y la idea de que el océano tenía un rol importante en formar el clima, realmente no era algo tan patente, tan obvio a la mayoría de las personas, incluyendo los científicos del clima, hasta bastante recientemente. Pero ahora parece ser tan obvio que el océano impulsa y conduce el clima forma la química planetaria, forma el régimen de temperatura de todo el planeta. Sin el océano no habría clima. El océano es la fuerza gobernante que subyace la naturaleza del planeta como un todo y no es solamente un fenómeno físico. Ahora sabemos que es el océano vivo que es realmente el conductor de la naturaleza del planeta, que es nuestro hogar. Solamente en los tiempos recientes el concepto de carbono azul ha tomado importancia y se empezó a apreciar que cada cosa viva, de los microbios hasta las ballenas, de los seres humanos hasta los peces, somos todos unidades en base a carbono. El rol de los árboles en la Tierra gradualmente entró en importancia al tener fotosíntesis, capturar el carbono y liberar oxígeno a la atmósfera, creó la primera parte de las redes alimentarias que son tan obvias sobre la Tierra. Pero no es tan obvio el rol de los bosques y el rol del fitoplancton en el mar, el capturar carbono, liberar oxígeno, creando el inicio de las grandes redes alimentarias en el océano. Solamente fue hace un año atrás, en el Foro Económico Mundial, en Davos, el Fondo Monetario Internacional divulgó un estudio de la importancia del carbono azul, el carbono que es inherente en las ballenas, que es un factor que deberíamos tomar en cuenta. Colocaron una valorización en dólares, una cifra en dinero de las ballenas vivas en cuanto a su captura de carbono, su secuestración de carbono y también el reciclaje de nutrientes, alimentándose del krill, zooplancton, pequeños peces, retienen el carbono en sus grandes cuerpos y también colocan nutrientes de vuelta al sistema que ayuda el fitoplancton que captura el carbono, libera el oxígeno y crea el inicio del ciclo de oxígeno que es tan evidente en el océano. Ahora, si funciona para las ballenas, funciona para el atún, funciona para los peces, los camarones, por toda la vida en el océano. Reciben energía del sol, capturan carbono con los organismos fotosintéticos en el océano y mantienen el ciclo y los ciclos de la vida que han estado en movimiento por literalmente cientos de millones de años. El clima de hoy, el planeta vivo de hoy, es un proceso que comenzó 4,5 mil millones de años atrás, pero en casi 4 décadas y media, los seres humanos, nosotros, hemos tenido éxito en interrumpir significativamente estos ciclos antiguos, naturales de la atmósfera, de la Tierra, de la vida, cortando estas conexiones entre sí, entre la captura del carbono, los ciclos de nutrientes que forman el mundo que em- conocemos y que hemos tomado como algo dado por hecho, y ahora sabemos que nuestras acciones han interrumpido estos ritmos y el conocer e identificar los problemas nos da la mayor esperanza de tomar acción que puede llevar a un mundo que continúa siendo favorable hacia nosotros. La forma que estamos haciendo todos y continuamos interrumpiendo y disruptando los ciclos de vida en la Tierra, bajando y talando bosques enteros, destruyendo estos ciclos de almacenamiento de carbono y liberación de oxígeno en la Tierra y ahora en el océano, escalando acciones que destruyen estos sistemas que básicamente conducen el clima y la diversidad de la vida, la química del planeta. Ahora lo sabemos. Ahora estamos armados con esta característica tan importante que es la comprensión, el conocimiento de cómo el planeta funciona en maneras y formas que nuestros antecesores no sabían y no tenían cómo saberlo. Ahora es el momento, esta década, nuestra última mejor oportunidad que tenemos para cambiar nuestro comportamiento hacia el mundo natural. Los ingenieros inteligentes están creando formas, teniendo ideas de cómo podemos capturar el carbono y acelerar la captura de carbono utilizando distintos dispositivos ingeniosos, pensando en qué podemos colocar en la atmósfera que puede protegernos del sol, por ejemplo, para enfriar el planeta. Dispositivos mecánicos que capturan, por ejemplo, dióxido de carbono de la atmósfera y la secuestran. Pero el dispositivo más poderoso de captura de carbono son los naturales, los árboles en la tierra, fitoplancton en el océano, carbono azul. Ahora sabemos que el proteger los sistemas naturales sobre la tierra tiene un impacto aumentado y el proteger los océanos con las grandes áreas donde permitimos que la vida prospere, donde no matamos los peces, donde protegemos la naturaleza de la naturaleza. La idea de proteger 30% de la tierra, 30% del océano, llegando al año 2030, no solamente es importante en mantener la diversidad de la vida, los sistemas de la vida, la química del planeta, también es una herramienta importante en términos de abordar el cambio climático. Nosotros ahora sabemos como nunca antes, en este momento de tiempo, cuando nuestras acciones, ya sea con lo que hacemos positivamente o el hacer nada y continuar con este espiral negativo de destrucción de los sistemas naturales que hacen que nuestra existencia sea posible, tenemos una opción, ahora es el momento, ahora lo sabemos, lo que hagamos o no hagamos en los siguientes años va a determinar los siguientes 10.000 años. Si vamos a resolver los problemas climáticos que amenazan el futuro de la humanidad, tenemos que resolver los problemas de protección de los océanos. No podemos resolver el clima al menos que realmente veamos los océanos con un nuevo respeto y un nuevo cuidado. Así que por la primera vez en COP25, el titular era el COP azul, el océano realmente importa, ¿no? Y en Escocia, en Glasgow, se va a reconocer la importancia final del océano de realmente dar vuelta a las cosas. El proteger el océano significa abordar el clima. Y este es el momento, las naciones están empezando a iniciar esto, a abordar el problema. Chile, por ejemplo, tiene proyectos de proteger 40% de estos aspectos y otros países están reconociendo la importancia crítica, incluyendo el clima y la protección del océano. Los altos mares realmente son uno de los puntos más importantes que podemos abordar en nuestros tiempos, el corazón azul del planeta, del océano, y debemos abordarlo con un cuidado mayor y mejorado. Esta acción es una de las cosas más importantes acoplado con lo que pueden hacer las naciones con sus zonas económicas exclusivas. Hay que ver las zonas polares, el alta mar y en conjunto ver el océano como la fuente principal de lo que podemos hacer en nuestro turno de estabilizar el clima. Muchas gracias.
Nuevamente, lo siento, pero ahora muchas gracias Silvia por su charla. Vamos a tener la posibilidad de hacer algunas preguntas al final, como también al resto de los panelistas. Ahora me gustaría presentar a Philip Hamilton. For those who just joined our broadcast, he's the documentalist. He's participated in very massive productions, allowing us to see the beauty of oceans and the richness of the most surprising creatures such as whales. He's a photographer and also conservationist. Philip, the floor is yours. Hola Paloma, muchas gracias por la oportunidad. Debo decir que es bastante injusto hablar después de Silvia, quien es tan inspiradora, nos entrega tanta energía para continuar con nuestros roles en la vida diaria, pero por otra parte tengo el honor de, porque ha recortado en un tercio mi charla, porque ya habló mucho del rol de los océanos. I believe that the audience is mainly speaks Spanish, so I will speak in Spanish. Hopefully you will forgive me because I don't speak in Spanish professionally. So forgive me for my mistakes, but I would like to speak of a matter that I think is so extremely relevant to the role of the media in conservation, protection of species, and climate change, and give it a spin. Let's go back to the basics and remind the explorers with Yosemite, with his pictures, who managed to convince the Senate. And now today we could achieve, of course, much more. But why cannot? Why can we not? Because of lacks of time, or because we still have something left? But the task is too great and too daunting. The climate change is daunting. It's a very broad topic, and many people would prefer to avoid this discussion. I remember that there was an expression saying that it is too large to be discussed, too broad to be addressed. If the topic is too hard, too difficult, people prefer not to make the change, not to make that effort. I would say to them, this African proverb, one of my favorites, that says, if you believe that you are too small to make a difference, it's because you probably have not spent the night with a mosquito in your room. So I think we can actually make a difference. Everyone can make a difference. And what I think separates us from animals today is hope. We as humans continue to have that, and we need to carry on. I would like to touch on some topics. One, knowledge and understanding to me is the basis to protect and evolve. We all know that, but it seems too obvious. But what would you say if that knowledge is not shared and it doesn't reach whoever needs to reach? Without communication or dissemination, science or discoveries are meaningless. So for many years, for instance, over 20 inventors already had the light bulb that Joseph Swan and Thomas Edison became famous for. But 50 years ago, it was there that they were businessmen. They knew how to market it, how to uh, disseminate this idea, and they actually took the credit. Clearly, science should work hand in hand with photographers and documentalists and all of the media. But we all know that sometimes scientists are too jealous and very protective, very their studies. So logical. Every
And
day we
Sylvia
have
is
that
one of the most
mission, so generous mission. The work of many scientists, I think, needs to be acknowledged, recognized, but more importantly, replicated. I am convinced that it's only thus, by replicating, copying the discovery and the good work of many scientists in a global manner in the planet, we can create a change for real. So why am I saying this? Because in a way, it was that Well, that's what I do. And what's that I decided to do and dedicate my time and work with conservationists and help them promote the outreach and disseminate their knowledge, their work. And that achieves many things to obtain more money and to do more. Those efforts can be copied in other places around the world because if the results are good, they need to be shared. Sometimes ideas are my own or of my own because I am on site and I discover something, whatever it is, but in the end, I'm always working towards conservation. I would like to show you something very simple. It's this right here. What does it say? 40% of assessed amphibians are in danger of extinction. Why? Why do you say this? If we were speaking about oceans and climate change, let me tell you this, because a while ago, an organization came to me and said, Philip, I have a problem. Well, how can I help? I said. They said, I would love to raise money for frogs, for toads, but since we don't have since we haven't managed to raise money for this, is that what led me to realize that there's problems for non-iconic species. They tend to not receive support nor funds. So what happens? Nobody wants to care. Nobody wants to do anything. And why? Because people who work in the media, who create documentaries, are more concerned about becoming famous or getting more money, earning more money, or gain an audience. So what do they spend their time on? Doing documentaries on sharks and or dolphins with because it sells well. But unfortunately, these little frogs and toads and other amphibians do not obtain this support, which is why one of the many reasons why I would say we haven't managed to protect many places. So my point is, what do we do to protect some ecosystems that are equally important? If we speak of the ocean, let's speak about mangroves, let's speak about seagrasses, let's speak about algae. That is equally important than coral reefs. Coral reefs are pretty beautiful and people talk about them, but and we have lost so many, but we have lost much more kelp. We have lost more kelp macroalgae that we have lost in coral reefs, or maybe equally, but very few people speak of kelp because who would even make a movie about kelp? Well, as many of you know, last year I launched a movie that is called Blue Forest, and we are releasing the Blue Forest version in English about this. So I would say there's a fundamental topic. NGOs, scientific groups, agencies, and other entities should support the media so that these not so well-known topics are somewhat addressed and can be protected. There are two things that I wanted to mention. One about this movies that have an impact on climate change. As I said, The Ocean Souls, which was the first movie in the series about whales. There was a very important, a big episode about climate change through the water pump that Sylvia mentioned a while ago, and the IMF actually assigned a specific economic value to each one of the whales. Just like in agriculture, a farmer with good water and good land manages to maintain himself. But after the hunting of whales, everyone thought that krill was going to be more extensive or found in larger amounts, but it was quite the opposite because indirectly, or let's say directly, the krill also feeds through phytoplankton and the zooplankton that is fed by the whale feces. So that is an important role that whales play. And I won't go into the details because Sylvia already addressed those. But if we speak about the blue forests, well, for instance, we know when I decided to launch this movie recently, I knew that I was in the presence of an environmental and ecological disaster, but I didn't know about the virtues of algae or kelp beyond their CO2 absorption. And as a marine ecosystem, as we know, it's fundamental. For instance, I didn't know that kelp could reduce CO2 or emissions or greenhouse gases emission if we give cows a little taxiformis, red algae, we can even lower their methane emissions in a vast percentage. Where we didn't know that we could create fabrics and create alginates for beer with kelp. So all of this is to just tell you that science and discoveries need to go further beyond ecosystems and species that are iconic, that receive funds and receive support. Let's think about the frogs and those little amphibians that I know that one of the reasons for their extinction is not their loss of habitat or because of the climate or water in some regions, but it's because we know that there's little money, little research and scientific help to support their protection. But as we said a moment ago, in the same way, this are vital, as Sylvia said at some point. Every little organism is important. We are in a tight relationship. We are one and we need to protect them. So we need to go and support the ecosystems that receive less support lately. And as we said, one of the examples was the one of the kelp forest, which is why I decided to create that movie. I think we need to think about this when we are releasing more movies or documentaries, when we are promoting campaigns, to think broadly and not only in those uh, very iconic species that continue receiving the attention from the social media in general. And with that, I leave you. And if there are questions for later, I'll be available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for your speech and talk. And now we'd like to present the last shall be the first. Valdemar has fought against dragons basically for being here. We're very happy to have you here. Go ahead. Thank you very much. I don't know if you could hear me well. Yes, yes. Okay, good. Yes, it's been truly a type of odyssey getting here online, but I'm happy to be here with you. But we're convinced that the protection of the oceans is necessary to solve climate change. And one of the most practical and efficient strategies for ocean protection is the creation of marine protected areas that contributes significantly to protect biodiversity, recovery of the fishing areas, and degraded ecosystems. Science recognizes the importance of marine protected areas and the objectives of conservation to restore world marine areas. Also, it recognizes the efforts of climate change and also the importance of preserving the oceans as a regulator of carbon dioxide and all the services that it provides. Now, we had a conference in 2015, Our Oceans, created by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also with initiatives led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have reached the 43% of the protected areas of the marine economical zones. It's the 10th largest in the world and sixth in the amount of marine protected areas per country. So then, scientific research has demonstrated that the marine ecosystems, as was stated by my predecessor, like microalgae, mangroves, and other vegetation, is 10 times as effective in capturing CO2 annually per area can the temperate or subtropical forests. This scientific evidence helps us impulse and conduce our efforts towards treating and tackling climate change with the same level of attention that has been given to forest, but in the oceanic aspects. So these blue carbon ecosystems within the marine protected areas provide an important tool in the capture of carbon, and also through the blue carbon ecosystems, it highlights a link that for me is inseparable. Here, we are choosing ocean health, climate change, and biodiversity. So, these processes that are seen and talked about within the UN have to be tightly linked among themselves. As a consequence, we believe that the adoption of new protection measures of a 30% of the world oceans for the year 2030 under the framework of biodiversity on the one hand, and on the other, a future agreement on marine biodiversity goes beyond that, plus the creation of a network of marine protected areas and ecological areas. And furthermore, the fight against climate change and the positioning of the ocean as a keystone to fight against climate change on our road to COP26 Glasgow. As has been said by Secretary Carolyn, Special Attaché on Climate Matters from the US, to attack this in a comprehensive manner, we have to do it with a mentality. And basically, this is about protecting the oceans and seeing the ocean as the key to solve climate change. Under this context, and during the Leaders Summit on Climate, called forth by President Biden last April, the president of Chile, Sebastián Piñera, proposed that we should even be more ambitious. We have made a call to a second phase in efforts in marine protection, giving it a character of urgent in all actions related to the high seas. This proposal is online together with President Biden's proposal and declaration that stating that this decade is a decade of decisions, implementation, and collaboration. So, what are we talking about here? It's about leading marine protected areas in our natural protection in the high seas as a way of tackling the climate crisis. The marine protected areas in the high seas is in the Southeast Pacific. It will be the first of its kind, and it's focused in protecting the Nazca area, which is known as EPSA. It's an area that's biologically and ecologically significant. This under the proposal of oceanic protection. There's enough scientific evidence of this biodiversity hotspot prepared by various scientists of many institutions, academicians, and civil society representatives. And it has been supported by independent studies and reviews. Another topic, which is well known, we are committed to protecting Antarctica and its ecosystems. And for the year 2018, together with Argentina, we presented a project of conservation of bioantarctic resources focused on the north of the peninsula with an extension of 72,000 square kilometers, 172,000 square kilometers. So in Chile, we are working together with many countries, including Norway, and we're focused on having bioclimatic support and changes with the idea of working together towards the sustainable use of the oceans, which also highlights the ocean as a key point in solving climate change. The panel proposes specific actions based on the oceans and identified as renewable energies based on the oceans, energy efficiency, marine transport, and the decarbonization of the industries. The protection shall establish coastal and marine ecosystems, reduction of the intensity of emissions in aquaculture, and the storage of carbon in the marine beds. Finally, I want to refer to the oceans and the UN framework on climate change. I refer in various occasions to the declarations of Secretary Kerry. And when we talk about oceans, he states that we're talking about climate change. And when there's a meeting on climate change, it's at the same time a meeting on oceans. Therefore, we have to achieve a greater level of ambition in these matters. So, to take oceanic matters to the framework discussion on climate change in the UN is an important driver for countries whose measures related to oceans are included in their climate strategies. And this is about highlighting the potentialities of the blue carbon systems, oceanic and coastal, be it algae, microalgae, and other vegetation, which together add to one of the largest carbon sinks in the world. So in COP26, we want it to be the second blue COP. It should include a clear stimulus for these to hold these strategies on climate change. There's a global balance that will take place in 2023 as part of a second cycle on the scopes according to the Paris Accords, and we could identify the gaps and opportunities related to the oceans. So, since the solutions based on this are related to resilience in the ecosystems. And since its financing, unfortunately, continues to be comparatively low, we must change the paradigm, accounting for the value of the natural blue stakeholders, identifying the need of investing and providing resources, incentives, and mechanisms for investment and financing. So here, what we're trying to do is to create roadmaps to foster blue carbon as part of the blue economy of various countries. I'd like to thank everyone for their attention. Thank you. If you're on mute, estás muteada. Countries such as Chile that can help a lot in the oceanic conservation. I think we lost Sylvia. Did we lose her signal? Perhaps she'll join us again, but let's use this time for some questions for the panel members. So we've talked a lot about the ambition. It's important to increase our ambition with respect to these topics, and that some governments participate in a faster or slower manner and increase their ambitions. We have more marine protected areas in some cases, and there's more of a will to conserve, but effective protection is complicated. That's why I want to take this question to Laura. After your presentation, what is the effective resilience? How are we doing in the resilience indicator for coastal communities, be it for that these communities being able to conserve more or adapt more? So you mentioned some initiatives. How massive are they, and how much do we need to increase the acceleration to reach what we expect? What's really going to create a solution? Thank you. That's truly a question that we're talking about because it's not solved completely. So I know that there are certain factors that limit the capacities for adaptation of communities in general. I work with coastal communities, but in general, we are very clear that there are some barriers and limits that we have to overcome, and that many times these are governance barriers, financial barriers, and sometimes they have to do in the way and with the way that these coastal communities have related to the environment and to the environment where they're involved in a historical manner. And yes, the way that we evaluate this type of measure and all these measures on adaptation comes from this monitoring. So, for example, of this monitoring of how effective the measures are, or simply determining a little how the environment, the climatic variables, the ecosystems, the species that participate in them, or the way that communities relate with it are important. So it's a very important question and interesting question because resilience from coastal communities towards climate change depends as much as on internal factors as external factors. And finally, it's a very important problem that will determine if you could adapt well or be less resilient. And it has to do with this vulnerability involved in these communities that they carry over. It has to do with a social vulnerability, ecological vulnerability, a vulnerability that has to do with the vulnerability of the natural system that uses this and that's related to this. I don't know if that responds your question. Yes, it does. Thank you. So the most important point is that we're in a complex moment. As Philip mentioned, it's difficult for us to take care of these unglamorous species, and it's even more difficult to give good environments to human beings that can carry out this good work in these communities. So we have a very systemic problem. That's why I wanted to advance with Philip here. You went from being an economist to being a conservationist. There are many people that are watching us that are specialists and that are convinced, but there are others that are working towards being in that area. What was that which transformed you into a conservationist? What was that inspiration? And can you please share it? Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So, the fact of the matter is that for me, this was no accident. It's actually a transition. I have 4 children, a wife, a family, and it would have been very difficult for me to base myself months and months on the sea while they were at school, and at the same time have them be at school and have a future. So I've been interested in the topic since I was born. I was in working in large banks, and I would say all my vacations I went away. My bosses put a satellite phone on me and they said, take the satellite phone wherever you go, even if it's the Galapagos Islands. So I was always linked to the oceans, but through personal reasons, I noticed I don't need to be dressed in Armani or fly a private jet. I once I created and had my new conservation point of view. I had a great car, a plane to Europe, but now I don't have any of that. I don't fly airplanes. I just have an electric bike. And the fact is, I don't miss it. So we create needs that don't really exist. The world, I'm going to tell you something. The world has been 50 years, 100 years trying to eradicate poverty, extreme poverty, and hunger. And in principle, it's been achieved. If you look at the amount of hunger that exists today, it's mainly due to political reasons more than economical reasons, because there's migrations that can be related to races or religions. But when you look at hunger, it's been eradicated. But as we eradicate hunger, we destroy ecosystems without asking ourselves that the destruction of the ecosystems will once again bring back hunger. Because without a doubt, there are communities today that are migrating because they don't have water, they don't have ecosystems, they don't have mangroves. So we lose a mangrove, we lose a algae forest, so we're affecting all these communities. And we talk with a lot of people that are people that have a lot of money of many foundations that perhaps are my old relations, but I'm going to tell you something. The bottleneck that they have, the restriction, the most difficult way for them, well, they want to donate money, but who, how to give the money? Those are the one of the largest bottlenecks that they have. They want to see a result. And when they give money to an NGO, a project, or an initiative to do that, so this is one of the problems we find, and I'm going to tell you another thing. I try to convince them every day, and I've had a large level of support. I'm having three other initiatives in ocean conservation. I'm going to have the blue version of oceanic forests, and we have world level ambitions on climate change. We try to tackle the 30% to 15%. The law is one thing, but the true inspection and true protection is much more important. I see this going around the world that the effectivity of protection of these ecosystems is very, very low. So the other thing we have to create sensitivity in the world because today more than ever, because I don't know if you know, but 2% of all world level philanthropy, only 2% goes towards the environment, and that is excessively low. People have to start thinking that if we don't protect the environment, we're not going to protect the survival of mankind, and that's something that we have to touch upon every day, and what we do, what I do with my current network, and what I try to do with movies and my networks. It's so terrible that we always have to talk about us dying for somebody to do something, and even with this argument that's so old and the world of conservation, there's still no large changes. And now I wanted to go to Valdemar to use their presentation. Well, Chile has had a role in trying to frame a type of guideline and seeing how much we could protect, right? But just as Philip said, it's very difficult to carry out that effective protection every day. We see how large Chinese fishing ships go over our protected areas. They breach those barriers. So you that work in this world, which is so complicated, which is a world of international agreements, what do you believe should be the international agreement on the minimum level we should have for the next COP in oceanic protection?
Well, thank you for your question, but before answering that, I wanted to based on what Philip said, many other environmentalists, such as my friend Mr. Bayo, refer to the basic aspects of life, and we how can we in our path make a difference? Now, to answer your question, I would like to emphasize on the effort that Chile made in COP25 that was accurately named the Blue COP, when one of the most important goals was to strengthen this bond, this link that we are speaking of between climate and oceans, reactivating dialogue between ocean and climate since last year. That was acknowledged through a report by the president of one of the subsidiary entities of the convention that created some key messages. For example, to persevere in oceanic related activities in the Commission. And this is important to integrate coherent actions in the agendas that are discussed among nations about biodiversity, oceans, and climate change. These three processes are interlinked. On the other hand, to increase ambitions between ocean and climate worldwide, including nationally determined contributions and adaptation plans, and the resource mobilization to guarantee that activities include investments in the ocean. I would like to emphasize on the fact that the panel of sustainable economy, where Chile is a member of, poses this balance between resilience, inclusion, and has identified a series of oceanic related projects of investment where the rates are even higher, 5 times higher to the cost. So we see the possibilities of investing in recovery after the pandemic, making the most of this opportunity. And now going back to what we intend to promote on our road to COP26, I would like to now refer to an initiative that we already launched in COP21 in Paris, and that is an initiative called Porque el Océano, or Because the Ocean, that today gathers 39 countries and a series of foundations and institutions, among other stakeholders. This initiative, as I said, was conducted in Paris, promoted by France, Monaco, and Chile. As I said, it has now 39 country members and has done great efforts to highlight the role of the ocean in the solution of the climate crisis, but also promoting the ocean activities within the framework of the convention. So we are working in a statement to continue strengthening this link. And we want to address key topics. For example, how can we ensure this global balance that includes the ocean as a key component by 2023, and or how can we promote higher ambitions with a new round of nationally determined contributions that will be presented in 2025? How can we strengthen the oceanic budget within the existing financial mechanisms? Because this is about not creating more financial bureaucracy. Or how can we make sure that in this COP26, we address the climate ocean link and adopt a new mandate to continue paying attention to this link? I would like to end with a very short reflection. If we prioritize biodiversity and oceanic sustainability in our collective response to climate change, this will undoubtedly have benefits not only for our survival, but if we don't, we will have great severe effects for the most vulnerable one. And I'm thinking in the least developed countries, in small island states, for women and for children. We're speaking of the justice, the climate justice. So we need to make of this production systems sustainable under the agreement, the third agreement about the implementation in the CONMEMAR, to protect marine biodiversity beyond jurisdictions. This is in the high seas, and sustain all the kinds of life in our planet and favor the good health of our ocean, that in our perspective is the key to solve climate change. Thank you. Well, I would now like to, well, unfortunately, we could not get Sylvia back. We had very interesting questions for her, but uh, now I'm going to close this conversation with Laura. Laura, it is not that I try to be less enthusiastic, but I would, because I would like things to happen for the next COP. But same question for Valdemar. What would be the achievement towards the next COP that we should point to in matters of resilience? What would be for you as a researcher and a specialist in the area? Uh, what would be good news in matters of resiliency? Well, how could I answer to that? Well, negotiations in COP are very complicated. We are clear on that. We're clear on the impacts and the effects of climate change. However, as Valdemar mentioned, it's tremendously important for these negotiations to be directed to those states and nations that are much more vulnerable than the rest of countries that have more financing and more capacities to adapt to climate change. And the states living in small islands are one of the most vulnerable and most damaged. The climate justice, as it was mentioned, is highly important because these nations are the ones that have contributed the least to climate change, but are the ones that receiving the highest impacts of it. So to me, in order to increase resilience, particularly for coastal communities living in these island states, as Valdemar put it, do not contribute much, but in the end receive the impact. Yes, it is indeed highly complex how this new planet reality makes us realize that solidarity and collaboration and making it the even conditions for all nations, it's a real way of fighting climate change and necessary ones, and also the health crisis. There's no turning back. That is the path to go. Solidarity. I would like to thank you and thank Sylvia, who couldn't connect back, but we have still much to reflect upon, and I appreciate all of the ideas that you addressed, particularly this thing about some species not being iconic enough, not so glamorous, and this goes for forest and with all of the biodiversity in vegetation that we know about. So there's plenty to understand of the interrelations of life and including it including our lives in that because it's no different. So thank you, Philip, Valdemar, and Sylvia, for your reflections. And thank you for the invitation to me to lead this panel. Thank you, Paloma Avila, for moderating so beautifully this panel on climate change and ocean conservation, and the panelists that also joined us. Let's just take a break of 15 minutes. We'll leave you with the documentary Puny, The Path of Water of Daniel Casado, along with Fundación Meri, that up to date has received over 8 international awards in documentary festivals around the world in the United States, Malaysia, and other countries. We'll meet back again in 50 minutes.